In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where stars burned bright and civilizations thrived in their unique ways, there existed a species known as the Grendak. The Grendak were infamous throughout the cosmos for their selfishness, their greed, and their utter disregard for anything that did not directly benefit them. They hoarded resources, exploited others, and left ruin in their wake wherever they went. Their homeworld, Clithar, was a reflection of their nature. Polluted skies, barren lands, and oceans choked with the remnants of their avarice. For centuries, the Grendak had survived through cunning and manipulation, always taking more than they gave. But survival came at a cost, and their world teetered on the brink of collapse. It was then that a new ruler rose to power on Clithar, a being named Zorath. Zorath was unlike any leader the Grendak had ever known. He was ruthless, calculating, and driven by a singular vision: to purge his world of its weaknesses and reshape it into a place of strength and dominance. To Zorath, weakness meant anyone who could not contribute to his grand designs, and he began a campaign of extermination against his own people. Entire cities were razed, families torn apart, and millions fled in terror as Zorath's forces swept across Clithar. The Grendak, once so proud and unyielding, found themselves hunted like animals. Those who escaped the slaughter took to the stars, seeking refuge among the many worlds of the galaxy. But the reputation of the Grendak preceded them, and one by one the planets turned them away. On the crystalline world of Xiphos, the ruling council declared, "We cannot harbor those who have caused so much suffering. Leave our skies at once." The aquatic beings of Thalassia, their voices echoing through the waters, said, "Your kind has poisoned your own seas. We will not allow you to do the same here." Even the warlike Dravok, known for their fierce sense of honor, refused them. "You are cowards," they spat. "You destroy, but you do not fight. You are not welcome among us." Everywhere the Grendak went, they were met with closed doors and cold hearts. Desperation began to set in. Their ships, already old and poorly maintained, started to fail. Supplies dwindled, and the once proud Grendak were reduced to scavengers, picking through the debris fields of forgotten battles and abandoned stations. And then, when all hope seemed lost, they stumbled upon a small, unassuming planet on the fringes of the galaxy. Its name was Leora. Unlike the bustling trade hubs or the glittering metropolises of other worlds, Leora was humble, a verdant sphere of forests, rivers, and rolling hills. Its inhabitants, the Leorans, were a peaceful people, known for their kindness and hospitality. They lived simple lives, in harmony with their environment, and valued community above all else. When the Grendak ships entered Leoran space, the Leorans were immediately aware of their presence. The Planetary Council convened, their faces etched with concern. They had heard the stories of the Grendak, their greed, their destruction, their endless hunger for more. Allowing such a species onto their world was a risk, one that could jeopardize everything they held dear. And yet, the Liorans were guided by a deep-seated belief that no one, no matter how far they had fallen, was beyond redemption. The Council sent a message to the Grendak fleet. "You may land," it read, "but know this: we offer you sanctuary, not servitude. If you wish to stay, you must abide by our ways." The Grendak, weary and desperate, had little choice but to accept. Their ships descended onto Leora, their battered hulls gleaming in the planet's golden sunlight. As the Grendak disembarked, they were met with a sight that left them speechless. The Leorans stood in rows, their hands extended in welcome, offering food, water, and shelter. There was no fear in their eyes, only compassion. At first, the Grendak were suspicious. They had spent their entire existence taking from others, and the concept of giving, without expecting something in return, was alien to them. They hoarded the food, built walls around their shelters, and eyed the Leorans with distrust. But the Leorans did not waver. They continued to help, to teach, to show the Grendak what it meant to live in harmony. One day, a young Leoran named Kale approached a Grendak elder named Vorth. Kale was curious about the newcomers, and despite the warnings of his peers, he wanted to understand them. Why do you build walls? Kyle asked, gesturing to the crude barriers the Grendak had erected. There is no danger here. Vorth, his face lined with years of hardship, replied, Danger is everywhere. We learned that long ago. Kyle tilted his head. Perhaps you have been looking in the wrong places. Here, danger does not come from the outside. It comes from within, when we let fear and mistrust guide our actions. Vorth had no answer to that, but Kale's words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he watched the Leorans go about their lives. They shared everything, food, labor, knowledge, and seemed genuinely happy. It was a stark contrast to the Grendak way, where every interaction was a transaction, every relationship a means to an end. As weeks turned into months, cracks began to form in the walls the Grendak had built. Not just the physical ones, but the emotional and psychological barriers they had carried with them for so long. Some of the younger Grendak started to join the Leorans in their daily activities, learning to farm, to craft, to heal. They discovered a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, but not everyone was willing to change. A faction of Grendak, led by a fiery orator named Clith, saw the Liorans' kindness as weakness. They are fools, Clith declared. They give because they do not know how to take. We can use this to our advantage. Clith's words resonated with those who still clung to the old ways, and tensions began to rise. The Leorans, ever perceptive, noticed the growing divide and called for a gathering. Under the ancient canopy of the Great Arbor, the leaders of both species came together to speak. It was Kyle who addressed the crowd. We welcomed you because we believed in the possibility of change, he said, his voice steady. But change cannot be forced. It must come from within. You must decide what kind of future you want, for yourselves and for your children. Vorth, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He looked at his people, at the fear and anger in their eyes, and then at the Leorans, who had shown them nothing but kindness. We have lived in darkness for so long, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Perhaps it is time to step into the light. His words marked a turning point. Slowly but surely, the Grendak began to embrace the ways of the Liorans. They dismantled their walls, shared their stories, and worked alongside their hosts to build a new life. It was not an easy journey. Old habits died hard, and there were setbacks along the way. But with each passing day, the Grendak grew closer to understanding what the Leorans had known all along, that true strength lies not in taking, but in giving, not in isolation, but in unity. And so, on the small, unassuming planet of Leora, a new chapter began for the Grendak. They were no longer the scourge of the galaxy, but a people striving to rebuild, to heal, and to find their place in a universe that had once turned its back on them. And in doing so, they discovered something they had never known before, a sense of belonging and the hope of a brighter tomorrow. But peace never lasts forever, not when the Grendak are involved. The seeds of change may have been planted on Leora, but what sprouted in the shadows was not unity. It was something far older, far more familiar. The Grendak had tasted comfort again, and with comfort came desire, and with desire came hunger, the kind that gnawed from the inside, never satisfied, always whispering, "Take more." Clith never truly disappeared. He just went quiet. While the elders and youth built bridges with the Liorans, Clith and his followers studied, not the soil or the healing arts or the ways of the forest. No, they studied the systems, the technologies, the neural networks the Liorans used to link cities, share knowledge, manage their energy grids. It wasn't long before they found weaknesses. The Leorans, in their honesty, had never needed strong encryption. They had no reason to guard their knowledge. No one had ever betrayed them before. Until now, Clith's faction, calling themselves the true Grendak, began to infiltrate from within. Silently, they copied code, studied infrastructure, learned how to manipulate information, skew data, reroute power, and in time they discovered how to bend the Leoran systems to their will. The shift was subtle. At first, it was just numbers, resource counts that didn't match, harvest quotas quietly adjusted. Slight discrepancies in the communal pools, nothing anyone would notice until it was too late. Next came the broadcasts. Quiet propaganda slipped into the communal screens, soft, persuasive language. Why must we always give? They asked. Why do the Leorans make decisions for everyone? Why do they get to lead? The voice was calm, reasoned, thoughtful. It didn't scream, it didn't threaten, it asked questions, and doubt took root. Some Liorans began to wonder, not many, but enough to create friction, enough to fracture trust. The Grendak were experts in division. Where they could not conquer by force, they conquered by confusion. They rewrote small pieces of history. Nothing obvious at first. A few archived files, shifted dates, altered names. Ancient Lioran teaching suddenly showed evidence that perhaps the Grendak were always destined to arrive. Myths began to reference travelers from the stars, allies in the Age of Fire. Forged documents, synthetic artifacts. They didn't just want Leora, they wanted to own it, from the past forward. And then came the money. Currency wasn't common on Leora. Trade was communal, based on trust and shared purpose. But Crith saw the opportunity. The Grendak began offering new services, off-world logistics, faster production methods, efficient trade models. They introduced a credit system. At first, it seemed helpful, a way to standardize value, increase trade with other systems. But it didn't take long before half of Leora's economy ran on Grendak credit, controlled by Grendak banks, held in Grendak servers. And just like that, the Leorans found themselves owing debts they never meant to create. That's when the Grendak made their move. They began acquiring land, not with force, on paper. Deeds, titles, claims bought with digital currency. One by one, homes disappeared. Leorans evicted from properties their families had lived on for generations. Administrative error, they were told. Transfer of ownership. A lie, but a legal one. The Grendak built walls again, this time taller, fortified, with scanners, turrets, checkpoints. Inside, they installed command centers, broadcast hubs, factories that hummed day and night, pumping out exports to nearby systems under the Grendak Trade Authority. A name no one had heard before, now stamped on everything. The galaxy, once so quick to reject them, had grown hungry for their new offerings. Fast tech, cheap labor, quiet compliance. Other planets began to deal with the Grendak again, not knowing or not caring that it came at Leora's expense. Leoran elders petitioned the council. They begged for diplomacy, for reason, for peace. But peace had already been sold. The younger Leorans, those who had once danced with the stars, now wandered displaced, pushed out of their homes, their temples, their forests, denied access to their own power grids. Private property, the Grendak said, for security. It was theft, but theft made legal. And still, the Leorans hesitated. They didn't believe in violence. It wasn't their way. They clung to the hope that perhaps, if they remained kind, if they just waited long enough, the Grendak would stop. But the Grendak don't stop. They spread. They infest. They infect. One by one, they infiltrated Leoran institutions, took seats on the council, appointed efficiency officers, created joint task forces where only Grendak voices held any real weight. They erased statues, renamed cities, rebranded holidays to include Grendak traditions, and no one noticed until they were everywhere. By the time the Leorans realized what had happened, their planet no longer belonged to them. It was still called Leora, but it wasn't. Not really. Now, it was Leora Prime, hub of the Grendak colonial network, a shining example, they called it, of interplanetary cooperation and shared prosperity. A lie printed on banners and whispered into trade deals. Kyle, now older, stood at the edge of what had once been the sacred forest, now stripped bare for a Grendak logistics compound. Drones buzzed overhead. Cargo ships came and went. Surveillance towers scanned the horizon. He clenched his fists. The peaceful boy was gone. In his place stood something harder. Vorth was dead, disappeared. Most believed he had spoken one truth too many. Crith now ruled the Grendak colonies as Chief Minister of Integration. His voice echoed across every screen, smiling, soothing, promising unity. Unity through submission. The galaxy, drunk on cheap goods and clean energy, turned its eyes away. The Leorans, left to rot in their own lands, began to fracture. Some fled to the outer hills, others bent the knee and joined the system, hoping to protect what little remained. But a few remembered. They remembered the original promise, the warning Kyle gave long ago beneath the great arbor, the message he once spoke with hope in his voice. Now he whispered it with fire. If you do not decide what kind of future you want, someone else will decide it for you. The Grendak thought they had won. They thought the Leorans were too gentle, too civilized, too weak to resist. They mistook patience for surrender. But beneath the surface, something moved, not just among the Leorans, but across the stars. Others began to watch, other species, other worlds. Whispers traveled the void. Leora is not what it was. The Grendak have returned, and this time they brought contracts instead of claws. And on 1,000 worlds, old fears stirred again, because they remembered the Grendak of old, the devourers, the deceivers, the species that left ruin in their wake. They watched Leora fall, and they understood. The Grendak don't need warships. They are the war, but even parasites can be burned out. Kyle looked to the stars one last time and swore quietly under his breath. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. And when the reckoning comes, we will not show mercy.